For as long as movies have existed, there's always been someone ready to point a finger and shout, "That's ruining the kids." It didn't matter if it was gangsters, rock and roll, or wild-eyed delinquents. Hollywood was blamed for corrupting the so-called innocence of youth. But here's the real kicker. The more people tried to ban these films, the more young audiences wanted to see them. So what exactly were these so-called dangerous movies hiding beneath the outrage? Let's peel back the censorship curtain. Reefer Madness, 1936. Imagine a film so over the top in its warnings that it became an unintentional comedy. That's Reefer Madness, the little exploitation movie that was sold to parents as an educational tool. What did it show? Teenagers driven into chaos after one puff of a cigarette. We're talking wild dancing, hysterical laughter, sudden violence, and complete mental collapse. It was meant to terrify, but it came across as cartoonishly absurd. The interesting part, it wasn't even released as a straightforward movie. It was shown in church basements and school auditoriums, pitched to terrified parents as a way to protect their children. Censors latched onto it as proof that the screen was a ticking time bomb, corrupting America's youth. Yet the younger crowd who managed to sneak a look didn't see it as a warning at all. They saw it as campy rebellion, the kind of forbidden fruit that adults didn't want them touching. Fast forward decades later, Reefer Madness was rediscovered and laughed at as one of the most unintentionally funny movies ever made. The very thing censors tried to use as a stern lesson became a cult hit, proving how badly they misjudged their audience. Instead of protecting youth, the film gave them a reason to mock authority. Now, that's a backfire worthy of the history books. Assassin of Youth, 1937. Hot on the heels of Moral Panic came another gem, Assassin of Youth. If you thought Reefer Madness was dramatic, this one doubles down. It paraded the idea that one bad influence could turn a clean-cut teen into a total menace. Filled with courtroom speeches, stern warnings, and scandalous parties, it painted a picture of young America on the brink of collapse. What makes it fascinating isn't the story, it's how it was marketed. Posters screamed with lurid promises, daring parents to keep their kids away while practically daring the kids to sneak in. That's the paradox. Every attempt to scare audiences off only drew them closer. Behind the hysteria, though, the movie reveals the mindset of late 1930s America. This was a time when adults were still struggling to understand a new generation that seemed louder, bolder, and harder to control. Movies like Assassin of Youth were less about the teens themselves and more about adult fears being projected onto the big screen. The censors didn't want you to know that their crusade wasn't about protecting kids, it was about controlling them. In the end, nobody remembers the plot. What survived was the legacy of moral panic, the kind of fear-driven messaging that turned corny exploitation films into time capsules of adult paranoia. If anything corrupted youth, it wasn't the movies, it was the grown-ups panicking over them. She Should Have Said No, 1949. When scandal meets cinema, you get this movie. She Should Have Said No wasn't just another lecture film. It was directly inspired by a real actress who had been arrested in a highly publicized case. Seizing the opportunity, filmmakers built a lesson movie around her downfall, warning audiences that reckless choices would ruin innocent lives. What really drove adults crazy wasn't the story itself, but the idea that teens would watch and secretly admire the rebellion. The film shows young people at wild parties, ignoring authority, chasing thrills. Sure, the movie tacks on a moral ending, but by then, the damage was done. The spectacle was too flashy, too fun, too tempting. Censors worried that the lesson wasn't what stuck. It was the sense of glamour around breaking the rules. Promoters leaned into the controversy, plastering posters with taglines that practically dared people to test their morals. The result? Teens lined up, eager to see what the fuss was about. Once again, the attempt to scare young viewers backfired spectacularly. What the censors didn't want to admit was that movies like this thrived on hypocrisy. They wagged their finger at youth while slyly giving them exactly what they wanted to see. And in that contradiction, the so-called lesson was lost. If anything, it taught teens one thing loud and clear. Adults can't resist sensationalism either. Blackboard Jungle, 1955. This was the film that made adults across America sit up and panic. Blackboard Jungle took the nation by storm with its gritty story of a teacher trying to control a high school filled with violent, rebellious students. It was a movie that didn't just talk about juvenile delinquency, it put it on the screen in raw detail. And let's not forget the music. The opening credits blasted Bill Haley's Rock Around the Clock, a song that became a cultural lightning bolt. Suddenly, theaters weren't just showing a movie, they were hosting mini-revolutions. Reports spread of teenagers dancing in the aisles, fights breaking out, and even riots following screenings in some cities. Authorities scrambled to contain the chaos, and censors debated whether the movie was too dangerous to keep playing. But the irony? The more they tried to control it, the bigger the phenomenon became. Blackboard Jungle didn't just entertain kids, it validated their energy, their frustration, their hunger for a culture that wasn't dictated by their parents. For the first time, rock music and rebellion were tied directly to the movie-going experience. Censors saw corruption, teenagers saw liberation, and history saw the birth of rock and roll culture on film. Whether you loved it or hated it, Blackboard Jungle made it clear. Youth had a voice, and it was louder than any censor's warning. Scarface, 1932. Before gangsters became larger-than-life anti-heroes, Scarface set the stage. Released during the pre-code era, this tale of a ruthless mobster wasn't just shocking for its violence. It was shocking because young audiences actually admired the outlaw on screen. That terrified censors. The film shows a character clawing his way to power, defying authority, and reveling in wealth. To some adults, this wasn't just entertainment, it was dangerous propaganda that might inspire teens to idolize criminals. Critics slammed it as irresponsible, while local boards demanded cuts or outright bans. In fact, the movie was forced to add a moral disclaimer at the beginning, warning viewers not to take inspiration from the story. But here's the truth. Young audiences didn't care about the disclaimer. They were hooked by the boldness, the rebellion, and the swagger. The very traits adults feared their kids would copy became the reasons the movie lodged itself in cultural history. Ironically, the outrage only cemented Scarface as a legend. It helped shape the gangster genre, proving that censors couldn't control the way audiences interpreted what they saw. Instead of corrupting youth, the movie highlighted something adults didn't want to face. Kids were smart enough to draw their own conclusions, and often those conclusions didn't line up with the lectures coming from authority figures. A Clockwork Orange, 1937. Few movies rattled parents and politicians quite like this one. Stanley Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange dropped like a grenade in the early 70s. On the surface, it was a futuristic dystopia. But what audiences saw was gangs of reckless youth roaming the streets, creating chaos with an unsettling mix of charm and brutality. For adults, it felt less like fiction and more like a terrifying warning of where society might be heading. The controversy was instant. Critics called it dangerous, politicians called it immoral, and some newspapers blamed it for inspiring real-life violence. The shock wasn't just the story, it was the sheer style. Kubrick filmed scenes with a glossy, almost playful tone, making bad behavior look both surreal and magnetic. Teenagers, already caught up in counterculture movements, saw it as daring, while their parents saw the collapse of everything civilized. In Britain, the outrage grew so intense that Kubrick himself withdrew the film from circulation for decades. In America, censors wrung their hands over its corrupting influence. And yet, the film refused to disappear. Bootlegs circulated, college students dissected its themes, bands quoted its dialogue. The truth was, A Clockwork Orange wasn't a manual for corruption. It was a razor-sharp satire about free will, power, and control. But the surface-level shock was enough for adults to panic. If anything, the movie revealed how wide the generation gap had become. Parents saw danger, kids saw art, and history saw a cultural earthquake that proved once again, nothing excites youth more than something adults desperately want to ban. The Warriors, 1979. This was the movie that turned a night at the theater into something resembling a street war. The Warriors was supposed to be a stylized action flick about a New York gang trying to survive a trek across the city. But when it hit screens in 1979, it was accused of something far bigger, sparking real-life violence. Reports flooded in: fights in theaters, vandalism in parking lots, even crimes allegedly linked to kids who'd just seen the film. Suddenly, critics weren't calling it entertainment. They were calling it an instruction manual for gang culture. Police departments and parent groups demanded action, and the studio was forced to scale back its advertising. But here's the twist: The Warriors wasn't realistic at all. Its neon-soaked visuals, theatrical gangs, and comic book energy were closer to a fever dream than a documentary. Yet to worried adults, it felt like Hollywood was feeding kids a dangerous fantasy. For teenagers, though, it was electrifying. The movie's defiance, style, and rebellious spirit felt tailor-made for them. Sneaking into a screening became an act of rebellion in itself, and like so many so-called dangerous films before it, the attempts to suppress it only added to its cult status. Today, The Warriors is celebrated as a cult classic, but its reputation as a corrupting force lives on in the stories of chaos that followed its release. It was proof that once again, when you mix youthful energy with adult panic, the result is a movie that goes down in infamy. Babyface, 1933. If you thought only crime movies scared censors, think again. Babyface, a pre-code drama starring Barbara Stanwyck, rattled audiences for a different reason. The story followed a woman who clawed her way out of poverty by using her charm to climb through the ranks of high society. In an era obsessed with morality tales, this was scandalous. The real problem wasn't just the behavior. It was that the film seemed to suggest she was smart, capable, and unapologetic. For many critics, that was more dangerous than any gangster with a Tommy gun. Adults fretted that impressionable young women might copy her boldness, while young men might admire her refusal to play by the rules. The backlash was swift. Censors demanded changes, including a reworked ending where she faced punishment. The original version, which showed her walking away successful, was buried for years, but audiences whispered about it, and the movie's reputation grew. When the uncut version resurfaced decades later, it stunned historians. The censored film had turned a daring critique of society into a cautionary tale, exactly what the censors wanted. But the truth was out. Babyface wasn't corrupting youth. It was exposing the hypocrisy of the system around them. In the end, the movie became a symbol of pre-code Hollywood's willingness to push boundaries and of censors' desperation to rein them back in. It showed how fragile authority felt when faced with a story that challenged their carefully crafted moral order. The Birth of a Nation, 1915. Sometimes the danger wasn't rebellion, it was prejudice. D.W. Griffith's The Birth of a Nation wasn't accused of corrupting youth in the usual sense, but critics argued it planted something far worse in impressionable audiences: hate. Praised at its release for its technical brilliance, the movie also promoted appalling stereotypes. Reformers, particularly from civil rights groups, warned that it was poisoning young minds with distorted history. They argued it wasn't just telling a story. It was rewriting the past in a way that made ignorance and bias look heroic. Screenings were often met with protest. Newspapers reported heated debates, and in some cities, the film was banned outright. The NAACP fought against it, but the movie's popularity kept it alive. Parents worried less about their kids copying behavior from the screen and more about their kids growing up believing the lies the film presented. What censors didn't want to admit was that the real corruption came not from wild youth, but from propaganda dressed up as entertainment. The film's legacy is a reminder that dangerous influence can come in many forms, sometimes wrapped in respectability. Ironically, the same accusations that haunted gangster and delinquency films applied here too, but with a sobering twist. Instead of glamorizing rebellion, it glamorized prejudice. And that, arguably, is the most corrupting influence of all. Public Enemy, 1931. Before Scarface stormed onto screens, the Public Enemy was already stirring up trouble. This James Cagney gangster film gave audiences a brash, magnetic outlaw who lived fast, fought dirty, and looked sharp doing it. For teens of the Depression era, it was intoxicating. For their parents, it was terrifying. The movie became infamous for one unforgettable moment: Cagney smashing a grapefruit into his girlfriend's face. Audiences gasped, critics debated, and censors wondered how far was too far. But beyond that scene, what really unnerved authority figures was the idea that kids might idolize Cagney's swagger. Unlike earlier moral tales, The Public Enemy didn't waste much time preaching. It showed a rise, a fall, and a character who looked dangerously appealing in between. That balance tipped the scale. Local censorship boards cut scenes, theaters faced protests, and the film was dragged into debates about whether Hollywood was corrupting the nation's youth. The irony? Cagney himself admitted he didn't play his gangster as a role model, but audiences didn't need him to. His charisma was enough to spark admiration, and admiration was enough to send parents and preachers into a frenzy. In the end, The Public Enemy solidified the gangster genre while cementing Hollywood's reputation as both entertainment and enemy. To censors, it was a bad influence. To kids, it was proof that sometimes the bad guy looked a lot more fun than the lectures from adults at home. Perversion for profit. 1963. This wasn't just a movie. It was a straight-up lecture reel. Funded and distributed as a warning film, Perversion for Profit was presented to adults and civic groups as a terrifying showcase of what was supposedly corrupting America's youth. Using overblown narration and cherry-picked examples, it claimed that modern magazines and films were rotting young minds, turning them away from decency and driving them into immorality. But here's the kicker: the film itself became part of the problem. Because while it wagged its finger and warned of corruption, it still had to show examples. That meant audiences, especially younger ones who snuck in, ended up seeing exactly the images the film claimed were too dangerous. The very act of warning made it irresistible. Critics at the time slammed it as propaganda. Some found it unintentionally hilarious. Yet civic groups clung to it, screening it as proof that Hollywood and the publishing world were targeting youth. But in reality, Perversion for Profit was never about protecting kids. It was about controlling what they could see, think, and even discuss. Ironically, the movie that claimed to defend decency ended up being remembered as a campy relic of moral panic. Decades later, it's mocked more than feared. And once again, the censors underestimated youth. Instead of teaching them a lesson, it exposed how desperate adults were to control the narrative. Fatty Arbuckle scandal films. 1921. Sometimes, it wasn't a single movie corrupting youth. It was Hollywood itself. In the early 1920s, actor Roscoe "Fatty" Arbuckle was at the center of a sensational scandal that rocked the industry. Though the legal system eventually cleared him, the damage to his career was permanent. What made the scandal so explosive wasn't just the case itself, but the way movies were blamed as the root of the problem. Newspapers screamed that Hollywood stars were living wild lives and that their films, by extension, were poisoning the morals of America's youth. Civic leaders claimed kids were copying the antics of comedians and actors they saw on screen. Theater owners panicked, censors sharpened their knives, and the entire industry was dragged into a moral firestorm. In truth, Arbuckle's films weren't inherently corrupting. They were slapstick comedies, filled with pratfalls, pies to the face, and physical gags. But in the eyes of the public, the scandal meant that Hollywood had to clean up before youth were led astray. The result? Studios launched new systems of self-censorship, paving the way for the infamous Hays Code. So, while Arbuckle's career never recovered, the bigger story was how adults projected their fears of corruption onto the entire industry. One scandal became the excuse to clamp down on creativity, proving once again that youth weren't the real issue. It was the panic of those in power.
Red-Headed Woman, 1932.
If one film summed up everything adults feared about pre-code Hollywood, it was Red-Headed Woman. Starring the dazzling Jean Harlow, This movie told the story of a small-town woman who used her cunning, charm, and unstoppable determination to claw her way into high society. And here's the twist. She does it without apology. No punishment, no moral lesson, neatly tied with a bow. For 1932, that was dynamite. Audiences loved it. But censors? They went into full meltdown. Local censorship boards demanded cuts. The Catholic Legion of Decency condemned it, and critics claimed it would corrupt young women by making them think independence was glamorous. In some states, the film was banned outright. Studio executives, terrified of more backlash, scrambled to add softened scenes and alternate endings to appease the guardians of morality. But none of that could erase the movie's impact. Jean Harlow's unapologetic character was unlike anything audiences had seen before. Instead of the usual moral downfall, she thrived, and that was the real scandal. The fact that young audiences could watch her and see ambition, boldness, and rebellion portrayed as fun was exactly what scared authority figures. Looking back, Red-Headed Woman wasn't corrupting. It was groundbreaking. It dared to put a fearless woman at the center of the story and refused to punish her for it. And in doing so, it became one of the sparks that lit the fire under Hollywood censors, ushering in the stricter production code. What the adults called dangerous was, in truth, just too far ahead of its time. So there you have it. 13 films that adults swore would corrupt America's youth. But looking back, one thing is obvious. It was never really about the movies. It was about fear. Fear of change. Fear of rebellion. Fear that young people might think for themselves. And every time censors tried to shut these films down, they only made them louder. Which of these so-called dangerous movies do you think still holds power today? Drop a comment, hit that subscribe, and let's keep digging into the stories they never wanted you to know.